I'm walking away. I'm walking away from the troubles in my life. I'm walking away to find a better day. Sometimes some people get me wrong when it's something I've said or I've done. Sometimes you feel there is just no fun, and that's when you turn and you run. I'm walking away. I'm walking away. Welcome to Extraordinary Stories Podcast. Hey, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. Okay. Well, I thank you very much if you got in touch about the last episode called Julie and Jeopardy. I learned a lot from that about how different countries handle their own double jeopardy laws and what the crazy loopholes are. So, I know with all certainty that double jeopardy will rear its head again in some future story, so I'll save what I learned from that very generous feedback for then. I also learned that my attempt at Shouty Man was really bad. I was called a sheep, a goat, an orgasming camel, and someone asked me if I had just dropped something really heavy on my foot. Lol. Well, never again, but at least I tried. No shout outs in this episode. I'm going to save them for another day. And instead I'm going to use the space to tell you very quickly about a podcast that I'd like to recommend. It's called The Storytellers Project. It's an American podcast which it collects different stories from different real people, and these people stand up themselves and they tell them to an audience, and the themes vary every week. It's very like The Moth, but yeah, I've just been really enjoying that podcast. So if you like real stories, you'll like listening to this. Secondly, I'm going to use this little time to tell a very short, very short story that's really just a newspaper article that someone sent me, because so many people get in touch when they find a really bizarre or funny or sometimes just really shocking story in a newspaper or in a magazine. So I thought, yeah, do you know what? Sometimes maybe I could just bring you those little stories in their little 1 minute, minute and a half form. So this came from Danielle Gruel. Now, I don't think I'll have said that correctly. I think it might be French. Gruel. Anyway, Danielle, thank you for the story. It takes place in Florida. And so there's a couple called Tito and Amanda Watts, and they were arrested for, this is very recently, arrested for selling golden tickets to heaven. They were selling them on the streets for $100 per ticket. They were telling the buyers that they were made from solid gold and that each of these tickets would reserve them a spot in heaven. They said to people, all you need to do is get to the pearly gates, present this ticket, and you are right into heaven. So they were arrested for selling these tickets. And this is what Tito, the husband, had to say. He says, I don't care what police say. The tickets are solid gold, and it was Jesus who gave them to me behind the KFC. And he told me I could sell them and get some money to go to outer space. You should arrest Jesus because he's the one that gave me the golden tickets. I mean, he actually said these words to police. I'm willing to wear a wire and set Jesus up. Oh my God, this pair. So, police confiscated from the couple $10,000 in cash from selling these tickets, drug paraphernalia, and the best line in this whole article, a baby alligator. What are these two on? What the hell's going on there? So yes, so thank you, Danielle, for that story. Lovely. Anyway, okay, let's get on to this week's short story. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. The story starts with a family called the Hoaglands. Now, the Hoagland family consisted of Father Richard, his wife Linda, and their 2 sons. So they've got 2 young sons. One is 6 and one is 9. Their names are Matthew and Doug. So Richard, the dad, how is he described? Well, people say he's a bit of a shaker and a roller, a spontaneous guy, and fun to be around. Richard works in insurance, and they're living in Indiana, and they're a pretty solid, tight family unit. So a regular Wednesday in 1993 rolls around and Richard heads off to work. Linda gets the 2 boys ready for school, and she sets about doing whatever she has to do that day. But this was not going to be just your typical Wednesday. Oh no, quite the opposite. In the afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Linda receives a phone call from her husband Richard to say that he's feeling unwell. He says he isn't sure what the problem is, but he hasn't felt good all day and it's just getting worse. So he says he's going to take himself to the hospital and he's going to admit himself to the ER and be seen by a doctor. So Linda is concerned, as you naturally would be, and after a couple of hours passes, she calls the hospital he was going to and she asks for any kind of update on Richard. Any information at all. Has he been seen by a doctor? Is he currently in a bed? What's happening? Is he still waiting to see someone? What's going on? Well, here's where the mystery begins. The hospital has no record of a Richard Hoagland attending that day. Well, check again, says Linda, because he told me he was going to admit himself to the ER. And she's told again, no one by that name has admitted themselves today. So then Linda thinks, right, okay, well there might just be a mix-up with names here. I'll tell you what, I'll give a description of him and see if maybe that might clear this up. So she describes Richard and she's told, nope, no one with that description has been here today. So where is he? Linda calls police. She calls her family. She calls everyone to tell them he's gone. He said he was going to the ER and now he's disappeared. So the police treat this as a missing persons case. It's very odd. Very odd indeed. Where is he? Where is Richard? I mean, essentially Richard Hoagland at this point has just fallen off the face of the earth. So after some searching, police locate his car. And it looks like this is going to be a big massive lead for them because his car is parked near Indiana Airport. Aha, they think. Great. But a very similar conversation to the one that Linda had with the hospital goes on because no Richard Hoagland took a flight from that airport. Now when Richard left for work that morning, all he had with him was what he was wearing and some money in his pocket. So he'd no passport. So, I mean, taking a flight anyway would have been impossible without a passport. He took no extra clothing, not even a toothbrush. So time passes. Days at first. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months, and there is no sign of Richard. This next bit just makes the whole thing even more odd. Months after his disappearance, both of his sons receive a birthday card from him. The birthday cards, they've both got money in them. They've both got $50 each. And he writes a note to one of the sons, the one who's 9. And he says, perhaps one day we can meet again. I probably won't know you by then. You'll be so different. Take care of your mum. Love, Dad. Okay, so he's not dead. So what are police thinking at this point? Well, they've got lots of theories. They've got lots of things that they want to explore with this story. And one of them is they turn their attention on Linda. They're not really looking at her as the abandoned wife or the victim in this situation. Instead, they're treating her for a time like a suspect in his disappearance. And I think I can get that. I think I can get why. You need to rule out, of course you do, any foul play on her part. I mean, poor woman to have to go through that, but you do have to rule that out. I mean, there's a really long period of time where they are sticking to the theory that Linda has somehow killed him and disposed of him. And when she says, well, what about the birthday cards? They say, look, that's easy. That could so have been faked by you, posted by someone else from somewhere else easily. After a while, police drop this because there actually just isn't really enough for them to carry forward suspecting Linda. So without Richard's income coming into the house, life for Linda and the boys, it's not great. They start to really struggle for money. They have to move in for a brief period with Linda's mum, and eventually they get enough money to live in a small place, and Linda, she continues to raise her sons. So 10 years after his disappearance, yes, 10 years, with the only sign ever of him being those birthday cards, Richard Hoagland is declared dead. Because there's never been evidence of him, he's declared deceased. Now we're going to go to 23 years later. It's quite a jump in time. So, Linda, still living in the same town, she's driving around Indiana, going about her life. Her 2 sons are now grown up. So she's driving about one day and she gets a phone call from a detective in Florida. And the detective asks, do you know who Richard Hoagland is? And she says, yes, I certainly do. Or, I did. And she asks, why? And the detective says, well, because He is in custody in a Florida prison. So what did Linda feel? Shock? Yes. Confusion? Yes. Joy? Not so much. Not so much. I think I get that. I don't think I would feel joy at that point either. I think I'd be like, yeah, you know what? You fucked off 23 years ago. Don't think I'm happy. Let's go back to shock and confusion. Where had Richard been for 23 years was the question that everybody wanted an answer to. Well, Richard had been living in Florida under a new name, a new identity altogether. He was now going by the name Terry Szymanski. Now, who in the hell in the world is Terry Szymanski? Is it just a made-up name? Is it something he's invented? Well, no, there was a real Terry Szymanski, and he was a fisherman who had died in a boating accident in 1991. So remember I told you it was 1993 that Richard Hoagland disappeared. And so Terry Szymanski in Florida had died in a boating accident. So how had he gotten away with this? How had he been able to live life with someone who was dead's name? Well, when Richard initially disappeared, the whole I'm going to the ER business, he was actually going to leave and live in Florida. When he got there, he rented an apartment really quickly. And the name of the man who he rented the apartment from was Edward Szymanski. Edward had lost his son a couple of years before in a boating accident. And so in the apartment that Richard was letting, there happened to be the death certificate of Terry Szymanski. Okay, yeah, so is that clear? Basically, he's taking on his landlord's dead son's identity. Okay, Richard, sure thing. Good. So he uses Terry's identity on the death certificate to get himself a new birth certificate, then a driving licence, then a bank account, and then a house, and so on, and so on, and so on. So he basically just builds a life with this fake name. It starts small, and it just gets bigger, and bigger, and bigger. And, you know, I suppose by the time you've got someone who's got a house, a car, a job, whatever, and that, you know, and they've got this name, Terry Szymanski, who's going to doubt it? You know, it's so many years down the line. What else had he done under the name Terry Szymanski? Well, he'd gotten married to a woman called Mary. And him and Mary had had a child together, a son. I don't think it was long actually after he got to Florida and took this fake name that he met Mary and married her. He also, in that time, he gained his pilot's licence. He bought property and he rented it out all over Florida. Now, whenever his wife Mary had any questions about her husband's family, like, well, you know, obviously, as you would, you're marrying someone, you would be like, what about your parents? Are they alive? Am I going to meet them? Do you have grandparents? Do you have siblings? Because he had no family to show. She said he always had an answer for everything. He could always answer it away. But in the back of Mary's head, she had doubts about her husband. Didn't stop her marrying him, having a child with him, and staying with him. But she said there was always a little doubt somewhere in her head. So he turns out to be quite the entrepreneur. He begins owning lots of properties. He buys himself a plane. He is living his best life. But it is all about to come crashing down around his ears. I mean, he'd gotten away with it for 23 years, but It was about to be all over. And this is how it happened. Have you heard of the website Ancestry.com? It's where you can go and you can look through family history, and you can you type in dates, I think, basically, of everyone's birth, death, perhaps where they lived, etc. And then it gives you all this information. You can keep going back and back and back and back. You can discover that your great grandfather was a Bible salesman, or or your Auntie Peggy was a milkmaid. I don't know. I'm just making these jobs up, but you know what I'm getting at. So, who's looking at Ancestry.com? The real Terry Szymanski's nephew was looking on this website just for fun. He was kind of hoping to learn about his family history when something odd pops up. He sees that his Uncle Terry, who is dead and buried, had apparently got married after his death. Now, bloody hell, that would confuse you. I'm sorry, what's that? My dead uncle got married a few years after his funeral? Sure. Okay. So what did the Szymanski family do? Well, they call the police. Police look into this, and they manage to track down Terry Szymanski. So they go. Detectives knock on the door, and they say, "Can I speak to Terry Szymanski?" And Richard's like, "Yeah, that's me. Here's my driver's license. Here's my birth certificate. This house is in my name." Detectives say, "Okay. Here's also your death certificate. So explain that." And it's at this point Richard realises the jig is up. He's been caught after 23 years. So right there and then, in the house with his wife, his son, he confesses that he is indeed the missing Richard Hoagland. Of course, his wife and son and everyone else who knew him are in just complete and utter shock. And it's at that point where his first wife Linda gets that phone call that day when she's driving round and she's told the whole entire story. So do you think she rushes to see him? Does she fuck? And I don't think I would be rushing to see him either. I think I'd be like, no, you're okay, stay where you are. So what's Richard charged with? Well, identity theft. And for this he serves 2 years. Fine, okay. But my thought was, what about bigamy? Why was he not charged with having 2 wives? Because he clearly married his second wife knowing that he was still married to the first. So Linda decides that she's going to go down the legal road, and I'm glad she does this. I'm really glad that she decides to do this. She seeks child support payments from Richard for the missing years. And if you read any headlines about this story, the first thing you'll see is that it'll say something like, "Man who was missing for 23 years ordered to pay $1.8 million to first wife." Whether those payments have ever been made or not isn't clear. However, what is clear is that Richard Hoagland will now spend the rest of his life as himself. And so ends the story. Now, when all is kind of said and done, what were Richard's reasons? Well, he says he wanted to get away from Linda and from his life in Indiana, and that's why he left. There's lots of conspiracy theories begin to emerge that perhaps he'd gotten himself into some debt in Indiana. before he left. But that could never be proven, and Richard would never say either way if that was in fact the case. In a way, as odd as it might sound, I think if it was money, it would actually be... I'm not saying what he did at all is okay or understandable, but I think if it was money, that you would have a slightly better reasoning for it than I just wanted away from my wife. Then fucking divorce her. Don't say you're going to go to the hospital and then just vanish into fucking thin air for 23 years. I just think that's ridiculous. Anyway, that's about it from me, my friends, on this story. Until the weekend, when the next story will be along. You can get me on all the social medias, should you wish to. Just look for Extraordinary Stories Podcast and you'll find me. Okay. Goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over.